I remember that night like it was yesterday. The city lights of New York bled into the rain-soaked streets, blurring everything, like the world itself didn't want me to see the truth. My name's Alex, and this is the story of how my mother's death turned me into something I never thought I'd become. It started on a cold Monday morning. The kind of morning where even the coffee tastes bitter and silence feels heavier than usual. Mom had been sick for months. At least, that's what everyone said. But when the call came from the hospital saying she'd passed peacefully, something in me didn't buy it. There was no peace in her last days. Only fear, and I could still hear the tremor in her voice from our last call. Alex, if anything happens to me, don't trust them. Them. At the time, I didn't even know who them was. At the funeral, I stood next to her coffin, numb. People I'd never met whispered condolences, pretending to care. But what really caught my attention was a man standing at the far end. Tall, mid-40s, slick hair, watching me like he knew me. When I asked my aunt who he was, she hesitated. "Oh, that's Dr. Miller. Your mom's psychiatrist. He helped her during her breakdown." Breakdown? That was news to me. My mom never told me she was seeing a psychiatrist. After the service, he approached me. His handshake was too firm, his smile too perfect. "Your mother was a strong woman, Alex. I did everything I could for her." His tone was polite, but cold, rehearsed. Something about him felt wrong. Days turned into weeks. I went through her things, photos, journals, medical bills, but one envelope stood out. It was hidden inside her favorite book. Inside were receipts from large withdrawals. Thousands of dollars, all paid to Dr. Miller, and at the bottom of one note, scribbled in her handwriting, were just 3 words: "He's lying. Help." That was the moment I stopped grieving and started investigating. I called his office pretending to be a potential patient. His assistant said he was on leave for personal reasons. No forwarding address. No trail. He'd vanished. Then one night I got a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "If you're looking for answers about your mother, come alone." Attached was an address, an old nursing home in Queens. Something inside me screamed not to go, but I had nothing left to lose. When I arrived, the place was half abandoned. Paint peeling, windows boarded. Inside, the air smelled like dust and forgotten lives. Then a voice, cracked and faint, called out, "Alex?" You came. It was an old man sitting in a wheelchair. His eyes were sharp, haunted. "I knew your mother," he said. She tried to expose him. "But he found her first." I stepped closer. "Expose who?" He looked me dead in the eye. "Dr. Miller. That man isn't a psychiatrist. He's a predator, and your mother wasn't his first victim." The old man's words hit me harder than any punch ever could. He handed me a small photograph, a younger woman, eyes hollow, wearing the same silver bracelet my mother used to wear. "She was my daughter," he said. "She saw things she shouldn't have. Miller ruined her life, and when she tried to fight back, she ended up here." My hands trembled as I stared at the photo. 2 victims. My mom, and someone else's daughter. I asked him how he knew all this. He told me he used to work for Miller. He wasn't a doctor. He was a con artist, one who targeted lonely, vulnerable women, convincing them they were mentally unstable so he could drain their accounts. By the time anyone realized, they were too broken to fight back, or already gone. I left that place shaking, but something inside me had changed. The grief had burned away. All that was left was rage. For weeks I dug through every record I could find. Miller's clinic had no official registration. His license? Fake. Even his background checks led to dead ends. It was like he never existed. But then luck, or maybe fate, handed me something. In one of my mom's old files, I found a USB drive labeled private. Inside were dozens of voice recordings. Sessions with Miller. The first few sounded normal. Therapy sessions, calm and clinical. But as they went on, they grew darker. His tone changed, manipulative. He wasn't helping her. He was controlling her, gaslighting her into believing she was sick, isolated, dependent on him. And then I found the last recording. It ended abruptly with my mom's voice whispering, "Please, stop recording. Someone's here." That was the night she died. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to face him. But first I had to find him. I tracked every digital trace I could. His old patients, his LinkedIn connections, even his email domain. That's when I found something strange. One of his old assistants, Lauren, had recently started working at a private mental wellness retreat in upstate New York, a place so exclusive. It didn't even have a website, just word-of-mouth referrals from the rich and desperate. So I went undercover. Fake name, fake reason for visiting. I said I wanted to recover from grief. They welcomed me in. The retreat looked perfect. White walls, smiling staff, calm music. But the peace felt staged. Everyone spoke too softly, smiled too long. Then I saw him. Dr. Miller. He was alive, well, and laughing, teaching a small trust exercise group like nothing had ever happened. It took everything I had not to attack him right there. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I played along. For days I attended his sessions, pretending to be broken. I studied his every move, the way he talked, the way he manipulated. He didn't recognize me. Or maybe he thought my pain made me harmless. Either way, I was invisible to him, and that gave me power. Then one night I followed him after hours. He went to his private office at the back of the property. I waited until he left, then broke in. Inside, it was all too familiar. Patient files, photos, hidden recordings, and among them, one labeled E. Parker, my mother's maiden name. When I opened it, I found a confession note, signed by her, saying she had taken her own life. But the handwriting wasn't hers. It was his. I took photos of everything, proof, evidence, enough to destroy him legally. But I wasn't interested in justice anymore. I wanted him to feel what my mother felt. Fear, confusion, helplessness. So I started my plan. I began by sending him letters, anonymous, handwritten. Each one said something only my mother would have known. You told me to trust you. You said you'd make me better. You promised you'd never leave. At first, he ignored them. But after a week, I saw it. That flicker of unease in his face. He started looking over his shoulder more, leaving sessions early, canceling appointments. I knew I was getting to him. Then I took it further. I called his office at midnight. Didn't say a word, just played the last seconds of that final recording. My mom whispering, "Someone's here." He hung up instantly. I wanted him paranoid. I wanted him to lose sleep, to feel that same gnawing terror he'd fed my mother. And it was working. But I wasn't done. The final phase was going to end everything, for both of us. By the time I started the final phase, I had become a stranger to myself. I could feel it in the way I moved, precise, quiet, surgical. Revenge had sharpened me into a tool. The grief that had opened the wound was gone. In its place sat a hard, cold will. I knew I couldn't simply hand the files to the police and walk away. Miller had covered his tracks too carefully. He'd built a world where he never had to face consequences. He had money, connections, and a practiced charm that could convince judges, juries, and social workers that the accuser was the unstable one. If I wanted him gone, I had to take the system apart piece by piece and expose him in a way that left no wiggle room. The retreat's security was lax. It was an elite place but built on secrecy and trust, not on metal detectors and attorneys. People came there to be seen, to confess, to be tended. Miller's hubris was his weakness. He believed himself untouchable because those around him were too comfortable to look closer. So I staged the one thing he'd always feared: exposure in front of witnesses he couldn't silence. I began with the easiest target, Lauren, the assistant. She had the loose mouth of someone who'd never learned the cost of discretion. A few late-night beers and a few well-timed truths got her talking. I bought her dinner and told her a story, careful to keep my voice calm, the way he must have spoken to his clients, gentle, unquestioning. I told her about my mother, about the recordings, about the file labeled with her maiden name. I didn't mention I'd already seen the file. I let her spill the details. People always want to be the one who knows. She told me more than I expected. Names, dates, the way Miller recorded sessions on hidden devices, then labeled them progress notes. The way he convinced certain wealthy clients to donate to an anonymous foundation he controlled, a slush fund used to pay off inconvenient people. Even more dangerous, she admitted that he kept backups of everything in a basement safe in his personal office. I didn't react. I let her speak, let her feel useful. Later that night, leaning over the ashtray of my rented car, I mapped the plan. The next week was a flurry of tiny operations that, stitched together, became a noose. I doctored appointment lists. I sent anonymous notes to wealthy clients hinting at impropriety. I planted a phony investigative journalist's email into the retreat's inbox and watched as panic rippled through the staff. Miller tightened. He began to micromanage, to hover during sessions, to cancel social dinners, and to stare at the door as though expecting someone to walk in and shout the truth. He did not suspect me. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I arranged the moment. I called Lauren and told her I needed to speak to Miller. I said my mother's recordings, the ones she had, were missing, and I wanted him to hear me say something, that I forgave him, that I no longer wanted to fight. People always expect forgiveness. It keeps them calm. What he didn't expect was how I would use forgiveness. I asked for a private session. He obliged, smug and polite, the same condescending doctor I'd heard on my mother's voice files. We sat opposite each other in his office, the afternoon light cutting through the blinds, patterning his face like bars. "You look tired, Alex," he said, leaning back in his chair as though he were the comfortable man in a comfortable room. "You lied to my mother," I said. No fury, no begging, just a statement with teeth. He smiled like a man who believes in the wall he's built. "She was fragile. She needed help. I helped her. You helped yourself," I corrected. "You took her money, manipulated her, recorded her, and wrote her a suicide note." There was a twitch. He knew I was close to the truth, but overconfidence gave him the wrong strategy. He tried to charm me. He tried to make it clinical. He needed me to panic, to unravel. Instead, I played him the last recording, the one I'd used to keep his nights sleepless. I'd uploaded it to a server and sent the link to a dozen people in Miller's orbit, 3 wealthy clients, 2 board members of his foundation, and 1 investigative reporter pretending to be a donor. They were not to move until they heard the words I wanted him to say. As the audio played, my mother's whisper, breathy and terrified, I watched him fold. It was like watching a man realize his life was a stage and someone had finally torn down the curtains. He tried to take control of the room, to tell a story of therapeutic necessity. He began to rely on the same manipulative phrases my mother's recordings had taught me. "You were paranoid," he said. "You imagined conspiracies. You told her to trust you," I said. "You told her you were the only one who understood. In the files, you called it care." My voice was soft but steady. I let the words land. I let the recording echo, and then, because he was trying to win back the room with logic, he made the fatal mistake of explaining himself. "You don't understand how the mind works," he said, going into that clinical monotone, the voice used to place doubt in people's heads. He thought he was salvaging his reputation. He had no idea the microphones were hidden, the cameras looped, the transcripts being typed in real time by people who wanted his head, because I'd anticipated the need for proof beyond my word. I'd invited someone he'd trust, a wealthy benefactor, to sit in on the closed-door sessions under the pretense of donating to the retreat. She arrived with a tape recorder and a veneer of wounded concern. She was one of the clients who'd received my anonymous letter. She had lost a sibling, or so she claimed. She was one of those hollowly sympathetic people who loved a drama. I needed her to be credulous but enraged. And she was both. He began to speak candidly, condescending, betraying his methodology with clinical precision, dosing, isolating, persuading families, and then ensuring the narrative held in court. He confessed. Not a full confession of murder or manslaughter, but enough. Enough to show pattern, intent, and a cruelty that could never be painted as benevolent care. When he realized the tape was rolling, when he saw the faces in the room slowly narrow from curiosity to disgust, he went for the doctor's instinct to normalize, to rationalize. He tried to talk his way back into control. It failed. The woman leaned forward and, with a simple forensic directness, asked him a question that would become the headline. Did you ever administer medication to make patients less coherent so they would sign over assets or be deemed incompetent? The silence that followed was the sound of his empire beginning to collapse. He stammered, then started telling the truth in fragments, admitting to therapeutic dosing and implying ways in which dependency had been cultivated. Those words, taken out of his sanitizing clinical language, couldn't be softened. The message I'd sent earlier, the link to the recording, had done its work. Within minutes, lawyers for the benefactor and the supposed donor were on the phone. I watched Miller go from a man with a practiced calm to someone whose hands shook. Someone called the reporter I'd seated. Another called a state investigator. The retreat staff, who had lived in the world of plausible deniability, began to look like co-conspirators. They were not prepared to be dragged into a federal scandal. When the authorities arrived, it was not because of my file on a USB hidden in a book. It was because a web of people, enraged clients, a donor-turned-activist, a reporter with bylines, had converged, and the evidence was loud enough and consistent enough to force action. The police and state investigators executed search warrants. They found the safe I'd been told about and, yes, backups of recordings, the ledgers of donations, the falsified progress notes. They found prescriptions written without supervision and bank transfers that traced to shell accounts. Miller tried to maintain his innocence even as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked at me through the glass of the police car and mouthed, "You don't understand." I wanted to tell him I did. I understood completely. I understood the hunger, the rationalizations, the terrible arithmetic that let men like him sleep at night. But I didn't say anything. I watched him taken away the same way I'd watched my life nearly get taken from me. There were arrests. There were headlines. The retreat closed. Lawsuits began to bloom like poisonous flowers. The state revoked licenses. The reporter I'd seated wrote an expose that ran for 3 days on every major platform, and agents from higher investigators started to ask uncomfortable questions about his influence over judges and hospitals. I handed everything, every last file, every recording, to one federal prosecutor with a reputation for letting victims speak. She did what she had to do. She built a case that would not let Miller slither out on a technicality. In court, he realized what I'd aimed for. Not just his downfall, but the dismantling of the very machinery that let him operate. The judge read names off the record, the victims' testimonies cut like glass, and the prosecutors played the recordings. They made the pattern plain: manipulation, dependency, financial exploitation, and the deliberate destruction of lives. When the verdict came, there was no dramatic confession in the courtroom. There was only the long silence as jurors filed past him, their faces tired but resolute. Guilty on multiple counts, years, maybe decades. He looked at me again in that last moment before he was let out, and I saw something like a man who finally recognized the scope of what he'd done. But it was too late for him to unmake it. After the trial, the adrenaline left me in waves. At first I was elated, a kind of savage joy that comes from seeing the monster you hate reduced to a historical footnote. People thanked me. Strangers sent messages saying I'd saved them. The old man in the wheelchair called to say he'd seen his daughter smile for the first time in years. Lauren sent a message, "I'm sorry." It wasn't the apology I'd wanted. It was resigned and human. I accepted it anyway, but there was a quieter cost. There are moments when you realize that the person you had to become to win is not the person you were. Late at night, when the city's lights blinked like a million watchful eyes, I would hear my mother's voice, not pleading, but asking a softer question. "Alex, what did you lose to win this?" I never had an answer that satisfied me. I donated the money I could find to a foundation for victims, one that helped people fight guardianship abuses and predatory caregivers. I met with prosecutors and testified, and my testimony helped change some procedures so what happened to my mother would be harder to do to someone else. But the changes were incremental, bureaucratic victories against something that felt ancient and humanly ugly. People asked me over and over what I wanted after Miller was gone. "A normal life," I said. I wanted my mother back, and that was the truth. But I also had something new, a sense of responsibility, slippery and bitter, that I would not let the machinery of harm grind on, ignoring the victims. I helped found a small nonprofit that paired investigators with families who felt powerless. The work was slow and heartbreaking and real, and in that work I found a strange sense of purpose. A year later, I visited the nursing home where the old man had watched over his daughter. He was thinner, but alive. "You did good," he said without preamble. I laughed, an odd short sound. "Did I?" I asked him. He looked at me, steady as a man who had seen a long list of human disasters. "You stopped a snake," he said. "But snakes are born everywhere. You can't stop them all." I left the home thinking that was the most honest thing anyone had said to me. You can win battles and still live in a world full of harm. The victory tastes like pennies when you remember what was taken. There is one thing I never told anyone. Not the old man, not Lauren, not the prosecutors. On the night before Miller's indictment, I stood in the empty office that had once been his. I sat at his chair and I listened to the tapes of my mother, of other women, over and over until their voices blurred into a single hum. I imagined what it would feel like to have the power he had, to make people believe, to make them doubt themselves. And then I realized with a cold clarity how close I had come to becoming the thing I despised. I made a choice then. I walked out of that office and I burned the file I had kept for myself, the one that proved every manipulation, not because the evidence was useless, but because I needed to stop being its keeper. Evidence had a place, and justice would take what it needed. But vengeance was not something I could archive and return to like a comfortable tool. It would rot you from the inside. Now sometimes when Emma asks about grandparents, I tell her small, safe things. I tell her truth without poison, and I teach her the language of boundaries and consent and strength. I teach her that not everyone who smiles is kind, and not everyone who promises help has good intentions. She nods and goes back to her games, and for a while the world is simple and bright again. But the city keeps moving. Predators adapt. New men with practiced smiles take the place of old ones who are dragged into daylight. The work continues. I keep doing mine. If you ask me now, after the verdict, after the headlines, after the quiet, whether the end justified the means, I won't give you a neat answer. I'll say this: I saved people I loved. I dismantled a machine that had devoured lives. But I also learned something harder, that the hunger for vengeance is an appetite that, once fed, will always want more. So I watch, and I listen, and when I find the trembling voice that hopes someone will hear it, I go. I stand in the rain-slick streets outside grocery stores. I sit on benches outside nursing homes, and I look for the small signs. Sometimes the warning comes from a homeless man with a rusty cart. Sometimes it comes from a woman who won't sleep, or a ledger left in a book. Once, in a grocery store parking lot, a man with wild eyes grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't get in the car." I let go. I walked away. And when he folded back into the crowd, I thought of my mother and the small, fragile choices that keep us alive. In the end, I didn't get my mother back. But I made sure her name had weight. I made sure that a man who had believed himself above consequence would learn what it meant to be powerless. I don't pretend it felt like victory the way people imagine in movies. It felt more complicated, like the city at dusk, beautiful and dangerous, and not quite healed. People ask what I would have done differently. I tell them the truth. I would have let the law do its work earlier. Maybe some part of this could have been less ugly, but I would not change that I fought. I would not change that I chose to answer the whisper with action. And if you ever find yourself standing on the sidewalk, and someone with a cart or a shaky voice gives you a warning, take it. Sometimes strangers are the only ones who will see the monster walking beside you.